Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for this Apple Ruth webinar, LD, ADHD, 2E, How to Support Students Who Learn Differently. My name is Jenna Burke. I'm a premium tutor and executive function coach here at Apple Ruth, and I'm excited to go through all of these letters and numbers with you this evening. We are going to have a Q&A after I'm done with this presentation, so please drop your questions in the Q&A form. I will be delighted to answer any questions that you might have, and feel free to put those in as we go along. So if something that I say strikes a chord and you want to know more, or you've got a question that's related to it, please don't hesitate to type into the Q&A as I go forward. So it looks like we've got a great number of people already in, so I'm just going to get started because we've got so much to cover, and I'm so excited to cover it with you this evening. So first off, a little bit about Apple Ruth, if you don't know us yet. Our why, our reason for existing is that we know that when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives, you change what they're capable of. And I find that that's especially true of students in the learning difference community. A lot of times self-belief is a real struggle. And if with the right person in their lives, you can really change what they know that they're capable of accomplishing. We build skills for school and beyond. That includes academic tutoring, test prep, and executive function coaching, which I'm sure I'll be talking about a lot this evening. So this evening, my objectives are to identify those common learning differences, the ones that pop up the most often, discuss some common accommodations for students with learning differences, and introduce strategies that you can use in your own home. But first, let's do some definitions. So I know I threw a lot of letters and numbers at you all in the very title of this webinar, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page going forward. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit / Hyperactivity Disorder, and I actually have a little bit of a quibble even with the title of that name, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. ADHD affects about 8.4% of children, and you usually see it in terms of differential brain development and delays in brain maturation. And that often will show itself as challenges with executive functioning, regulating attention, and inhibition, or the ability to inhibit your own actions. There's also ADD inattentive, so you'll notice that the hyperactivity is not involved there. So this is usually characterized by difficulty holding attention on tasks easily. It might look like that person doesn't seem to listen or has trouble organizing themselves. Basically, you have to exert a ton more energy just to create the inhibition, the feeling of, I'm not going to daydream while you talk to me, I'm going to focus on what you say. ADHD hyperactive is the specific subset where you have a lack of physical inhibition. So if you've ever seen someone who seems on the go or driven by a motor, that's perhaps somebody with ADHD hyperactive. This could be somebody who interrupts or intrudes on others, isn't able to stop themselves from jumping in when somebody else is speaking. And then there's ADHD combined, which is symptoms of both inattention and hyperactivity. So something that's really near and dear to my heart is the fact that ADHD is not just a symptom of, not getting enough recess or being on your tablet too often. There really are genuine neurological brain differences for people with ADHD. And something else is in the neurotypical community, there's a lot of debate about whether people should use person first language. So a person with ADHD as opposed to, say, an autistic person, where that's the diagnosis first language. I'm going to be jumping back and forth between those two all evening, but some people do have preferences. So I do want to acknowledge that. So what makes the ADHD brain different? So if you look in the frontal cortex, so that's the dark blue on my map right over here, that controls attention and executive function and organization. The limbic system regulates your emotions as well as your attention, your ability to focus. The basal ganglia causes interbrain communication to short circuit if it's not set up properly. So that looks like inattention, when really it's an inability to communicate between different circuits in the brain. And then the reticular activating system, which is a major relay system in the brain. And if that's not functioning correctly, it can cause inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. So these are all physical differences in the brain. So the main culprits, the main things that make things go haywire are norepinephrine and dopamine. So norepinephrine is made from dopamine. It's a chemical messenger that transmits nerve signals. And if you have, say, too much of it, you might feel too alert, too aroused. Your attention might be all over the place. It also affects your sleep-wake cycle, your mood, and your memory. So if you have ADHD and you're watching this and you're thinking, that's right, I have such difficulty turning my brain off to go to sleep, it could be the norepinephrine to blame, that you've got too much of it at the wrong times of day so that you can't turn your brain off. Dopamine regulates the pleasure center of the brain. So if you don't have enough dopamine, it is really hard to pay attention to something boring if you feel like you're in a desert and you desperately need the water of dopamine, if you'll allow the metaphor. On the other hand, there is hyperfocus. So you are paying attention to something that brings you pleasure and you don't want to stop. So whether that's playing video games for 5 hours on a Sunday, or maybe it's doing a deep dive into Wikipedia, or just like you're reading this really cool book that you love and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's 3 a.m. Hyperfocus can sometimes be as difficult to deal with as when you have a lack of attention, which is where I get to my mini, tiny soapbox, which is I see ADHD not as attention deficit, but as attention dysregulation. So by that, I mean, it's not that there's no attention, it's that you're having difficulty focusing it, getting it to occur on the thing that you want to prioritize. So it could be that you really do want to pay attention to the teacher, but there is a bird chirping outside the window and it feels like that is just as loud as what the teacher is saying in the classroom, and you can't get your brain to switch off the focus on the bird. So I think it can be really helpful, because I know that it can be frustrating for the people around someone with ADHD if it feels like they're never being listened to or they're being ignored. And really, it genuinely is that the attention is just being spent somewhere else. It's sort of like there's you've got a sieve and the attention is just leaking out all of the different holes instead of creating a nice funnel. Something that you may also see is that neurodiversity diagnoses frequently co-occur. So between 31 to 45% of children who have been diagnosed with ADHD also have a learning disability. 25 to 40% of children with dyslexia also have ADHD, and 25% of children with ADHD specifically have dyslexia. There's also a very strong link with people on the autism spectrum. ADHD presents in 50 to 70% of individuals with autism. And if you've got autism, you've got between, and I know this is a very large statistic, but between 20 to 50% of people with ADHD are going to have autism as well. So there's a lot going on in the same areas that are causing a lot of complications in a lot of different ways. So I've talked a little bit about executive functioning. I've mentioned it in passing, but let me get a little more specific about what those skills are. I think that there's a lot more talk of executive function skills these days, at least in all of the educational journals that I'm reading. But in case you're reading things that are less nerdy than I am, here are the executive function skills that I'm looking for when I'm working with a student and I'm coaching them. So planning, the ability to go, okay, my paper's due on this day, so when do I need to get the outline done? When do I need to get the rough draft? When do I want to make sure that I have my bibliography to turn in? The ability to plan that paper out ahead of time. Prioritization. I've got a quiz that I need to study for, and I've got homework, and I've got a test in a week, and I've got a paper in 2 weeks. What should I do tonight? So a lot of times, if you have poor executive function skills, you're picking something that maybe feels really good in the short term, but isn't actually making sense from a prioritization standpoint. Organization. Where's my homework? I know I did it, but now I can't find it. Just the other day, I was looking for notes that I'd written about a student, and I was beside myself because it wasn't in my binder. It's always in my binder. And then I realized, oh, right, I had to switch rooms while I was tutoring, and I left it in that other room, but I never go in there. So I didn't even think to check. So organization, if you've got your systems, that can be really important, really helpful. When you don't have a system, you don't know where something is more likely to be. And then that's where you get the position of, I did my homework, but now it's going to be late and I'm not going to get full credit. And now I'm really frustrated and I hate school more than ever. Goal setting and follow through. So you can see this a lot if a student really wants to, say, get on the track team, and they say like, oh yeah, I'm going to go running every single day, but they don't seem to plan when that's going to happen. Or they're having difficulty thinking about how they're going to increase the amount that they run so that they can qualify to be on the long distance running team, things like that. Time management. Does it take you 30 minutes to do the assignment, or does it end up taking you 30 hours? Self-regulation is really interesting. The ability to say, like, I know that I'm, say, really upset right now, and I'm going to calm myself down. Or does it feel like emotions are kind of all over the place all the time? Self-monitoring, being able to say, I didn't do very well on that test because I didn't study. So I'm going to do something different this time. Or looking at it and going, I don't know what I couldn't have possibly done anything different. And inhibition, which I've mentioned a couple times before, which is the ability to stop yourself from doing something, whether that's, I am currently watching my favorite show on TV, I am now going to turn it off so that I can do my work. Or I need to stop doing my work so that I can go to bed. Those are both instances of inhibition. I'm going to stop doing something fun, or I'm going to go do something that's necessary. Transitions can often be really hard if you have a dearth of executive function skills. And the pillars of any good system of executive functioning is your working memory, your ability to remember things as you go, cognitive flexibility. You'll see a lot of these have to do with transitions, about being able to deal with change, which is so hard, and self-control, which really keys into self-regulating, self-monitoring, inhibition, but also just generally being able to prioritize long-term gratification over instant gratification, which can be very challenging for all of us, no matter how old you are. So some other learning differences, dyslexia, one that's, I think, getting a lot more airtime these days, which is great. What I love about this font is it's not necessarily turning letters into what it looks like if you have dyslexia, but it's more, the font was invented as a way of showing people how it feels if you are trying to read letters where it genuinely feels like everything kind of looks alike. Like the ability to discern what's different between that C versus that D versus the G can be really, really difficult when your brain is doing weird mirror image things. So I'd say that this font is really more to cultivate a sense of empathy rather than an exact one-to-one correlation. But I do think it's a really great illustration of what's going on. And now I'm going to get very specific about what dyslexia actually is. So this is from the International Dyslexia Association. And they define dyslexia as a specific learning disability that is neurobiological. It does not have to do with the eyes. I think that's like one of the top 5 myths about dyslexia, is that it's actually something to do with like the way that you view the words on the page. What it really is difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition, which then creates poor spelling and decoding abilities. So decoding is knowing what a word is. So looking at the word CAR and going, oh, that's car. Encoding refers to spelling. So decoding a word, reading it, encoding, creating that word yourself. So the difficulties usually result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is unexpected in relation to other abilities. So often people who are dyslexic are incredibly intelligent. And so it sort of boggles the mind of the teacher when they realize that they're really struggling with reading, but everything else looks so great. This may also include or lead to problems in reading comprehension, reduced reading experience, which then now your vocabulary is growing slowly, which means that reading isn't fun, so you're going to read less, and it sort of feeds in on itself. 2E, which was something that was in the title of this presentation, stands for twice exceptional. And this is from the National Association for Gifted Children, which has some pretty good resources on twice exceptional. So 2E means gifted children who also have one or more disabilities. So the potential for high achievement, but one or more disabilities as defined by federal or state eligibility criteria. So this could be a speech and language disorder, an emotional or behavioral disorder, a physical disability, autism spectrum, ADHD, sort of any of these learning differences paired with the identification of being gifted. Twice exceptional can often be a struggle for parents to deal with because they're dealing with either a system that says, well, if you have a learning disability, you don't belong in a gifted class, or but you're so intelligent. You're getting all A's. I don't understand. What do you mean you've got dyslexia? So it's sort of, the inability to hold the two seemingly opposite things might both be true. So what this looks like in a classroom potentially is that the teacher sees a student who has high interest in math. They're just an exceptional math student. And they have excellent understanding and problem-solving skills. But anytime they have anything to do with, say, reading and writing in this particular instance, it's incredibly difficult. Everything grinds to a halt. Homework, note-taking, assigned reading, really, really difficult for the student, and the teacher's wondering, what is the holdup? For the parent's perspective, homework is a struggle, a fight every single night. It feels like other students complete their homework quickly. This student is taking hours. Her backpack is a mess. She doesn't know where anything is, but she has deep, deep interest in subjects outside of school. If you ask her about, the train system of the United States in the 1960s, she will just rattle off all of the different engines. She can engage for hours in topics that she cares about, but she really hates school. It's just not something that's for her, she feels. So that can be something that sort of, if you're seeing this kind of what seems like an inconsistency, that might be what's occurring. So a very brief introduction to several other learning differences. As I discussed before, a lot of these exist at the same time. So you may be somebody with several of these or know someone with several of these. So everything isn't just ADD. There's memory or retrieval issues, auditory processing issues, so difficulty understanding oral directions, visual processing issues, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. So dyscalculia is sort of, I'd say like it's known as like dyslexia for numbers. And I guess that's kind of true. I have this exercise here on the side that I think is kind of interesting. So if they've put a whole bunch of dots up here, and apparently children with dyslexia, or excuse me, with dyscalculia take longer than other children to count these dot patterns. A lot of people, when you look at this, you'll start recognizing patterns. So you might go like, okay, well, that's a group of 4 and that's a group of 4. And then there's 1, so that's like 9. But dyscalculics tend to count the dots 1 by 1. So it's just different ways of viewing the world. Dysgraphia is a similar difficulty, but usually with writing things down. So handwriting might be really difficult. In the days when people did a lot of handwritten essays for say the SAT, those would be the kinds of students who would get an accommodation to type their essay instead of writing it. And then there's dyspraxia, which is a developmental coordination disorder. And it's just usually like, I don't know, I think in the past, it might have just been like, this kid's clumsy, but basically like a difficulty with, say, hand-eye coordination, things like that. So let's talk about accommodations, which is the easiest way to make life easier and simpler for students with LDs who are in school. Getting the right accommodations in school can solve so many issues for students with LDs, especially extra time, right? Because those students are able to show what they know only when they have enough time. And something that I have heard from some parents very recently actually is, oh, well, I don't want my kid to have extra time because that's only really going to be helpful for them when they're in school. And then as soon as they graduate, what are they going to do? Well, I am happy to let you know that the Americans with Disabilities Act includes LDs as conditions where an employee may be entitled to reasonable accommodation or modification in order to ensure their ability to effectively do their job. So when you are an adult, if you need an accommodation for a learning difference, the ADA will protect you. So let's see. There we go. So in order to qualify for a formal accommodation plan, student may need to be evaluated. And depending on the school system that you're in, one or more of these may be necessary. So again, just some definitions of terms. Psychological evaluation is typically used to guide diagnosis and treatment from a medical perspective, not educational. So it's helpful in some circumstances, but it won't necessarily be helpful if you're trying to get something accomplished with your school. A psychoeducational evaluation or a psych ed evaluation identifies the student's difficulties in the classroom, their learning style, basically what is happening, but it doesn't necessarily diagnose or recommend treatment, but it will be able to say, this is what I'm seeing their difficulties are. A neuropsychological evaluation or a neuropsych evaluation is a formal assessment of cognitive functioning controlled by different regions of the brain. So that is a diagnostic tool. It's going to be able to say, this is why the difficulties are happening. So a lot of the time in schools, they're really looking for a neuropsych evaluation. That's what's going to be most helpful. And selfishly, as a tutor, neuropsych evaluations come with a set of recommendations at the very end that literally say, if you want to be an effective teacher for this student, this is what you need to be doing. And I love it. It's like a roadmap to what I can do really quickly without having to get to know the student. For instance, one of my students on their neuropsych evaluation, there was a recommendation to give them just like an outline of what you're going to cover so that they know what to expect in that session. Well, that was great. I could easily write an outline. I was already doing it for myself as a lesson plan. I can happily write a much nicer one with much better handwriting and give it to my student ahead of time. So then he knows what to expect. He's able to sort of keep track of that outline as we go. And I'm happy because I know that he's able to sort of pace himself through the session a lot better. So there's a lot that's valuable about all of these different evaluations, not just the ability to get an accommodation plan. They just let you know how you think. So when it comes to formal plans, I think that the IEP is sort of the most famous one that we hear a lot about, the Individualized Education Program. But then there's also 504s, RTIs. If you're in a private school, you have a school-based official accommodation plan, which is, dependent on the private school system because they don't necessarily have to go by the same rules as the public schools. But basically, if you are looking to, say, get an accommodation on high stakes testing, if you're testing to go to college, evidence that you receive school-based accommodations is key if you are trying to get accommodations on, say, the SAT or the ACT. Showing that you get these accommodations in school and that you use them Super, super important. A student of mine, we were working together and she really could have used extra time. And it turned out that she had been getting extended time from her teachers in school just because they were like, oh, don't worry about it. You can come back in at lunch and finish up. So it was all very informal. It was just teachers recognizing, I know that you're going to do a great job on this if I just give you a little bit more time. But unfortunately, the SAT doesn't take that as a, okay, that's good enough for us to see that you've got a record of accommodations, because none of it was written down. So having that record, really, really important. So other accommodations that are really helpful for students with ADD or ADHD, extended time on tests, like I just said, but also instruction and assignments that are tailored to the student. Positive reinforcement and feedback, really, really important, because remember, if you're short on dopamine, if you're short on something that makes you feel good, and you've got a track record of feeling like you're always failing in class, getting that positive reinforcement helps you to remind your brain that actually schoolwork can be fun. There's also assistive technology. I promise I've got a lot of stuff on this later. Also allowing extra breaks, time to move around. I will happily let my students like get up and like have a stretch break in the middle of a session, or just sort of take a break from talking about math to, okay, what'd you do this weekend? What do you have going on next weekend? Just because you're taking breaks doesn't mean that you're not allowing your brain to kind of spring back. And I'll actually talk about how we should all probably be taking more breaks when we work, and that's going to help our focus as well. An environment with limited distractions can also be really helpful. You can see if like your students allowed to sit at the front of the classrooms, they're not distracted by everyone behind them, things like that, or extra assistance in staying organized. So accommodations for dyslexia. So extended time is essentially a given for a student with a diagnosis of dyslexia. It is the gold standard umbrella accommodation. Students might receive double or even triple time, depending on the severity of the disability, because a lot of times students with dyslexia are just sort of looking at words and guessing what they might be. So you want to really be able to give them the time to slow down, to see what they've got in front of them, make sure nothing's being flipped. A reader or text-to-speech technology, also really good accommodations. But even if you don't use those, it's really, really important to see if that would be helpful in, say, a timed testing environment where there's a lot of pressure to read quickly and accurately. So these are even some more accommodations. So in the area of presentation, you can ask for verbal instructions instead of written, or that the instructions be repeated. Larger print can sometimes be helpful, or even printed on different paper. Sometimes different colored paper is easier to read, or visual prompts or cues that aren't written down. In terms of responses, marking your answers in the test book instead of on a separate answer sheet or a Scantron, an audio recorder, perhaps, to record a lecture, something like that. Settings can also be changed, whether it's an individual or a small group setting. Like I said, sitting in front of the teacher can often be really helpful. And then with timing and scheduling, extended time, more frequent breaks, because it's really exhausting when you're trying to read print that's just really not working for you, or changing the order of the tasks or the subtests to work to your strengths. So now what I think you're all here for, the helping from home part. I know that a lot of people during the pandemic, when they started having to be sort of co-teachers for their kids, there was a lot of frustration, a lot of angst. So hopefully some of the ideas that I've got for you all tonight are going to be really helpful. So modeling coping strategies, super, super important. And I think that this honestly goes for everyone. We all need to change the way that we view mistakes. I think that we as a society are so hard on ourselves. We want to be getting it right away. And you just can't learn unless you're making mistakes. There's no way that you're going to do everything perfectly the first time. So the more that you can show your students that you're making mistakes and you're recovering from them and the world didn't end, that's going to allow your student to learn the value of their mistakes, so that every time, if they mess up on a school assignment or they fell down in their organizing and now it's just not, their room is a mess again, it's okay. It's not a crisis. We're going to learn from the mistake. So the mistake is a chance to learn. Sometimes with my students, I'll say something along the lines of like, instead of saying, how did I mess this up? Or, oh, I'm so annoyed, I'd much rather that they say, oh, interesting. Right? A mistake is a time to be interested in what you did and how you can change it. So a strength-based focus for optimizing learning is a really good idea. Why force yourself to learn in a way that is not helpful? So if you are a better listener than reader, audiobooks are your friend. Get the tools that will help you be your best. If you are somebody who needs to play like lo-fi music to block out the noise while doing your homework, that is okay. That does not make you somebody who is trying to be distracted. You know how your brain works. I really like Coffeetivity is a website that has like various background sounds of like cafes or libraries, just sort of like a gentle hum. And when I need to do like really deep focus work, or I need to kind of just sort of grind out a whole bunch of emails, that kind of music actually really helps me to feel more productive. And so I know that that's a tool and I have in my back pocket. If you need to move, if you need to throw a ball against the wall to help you study or focus, that's great. Find a way to enable that without bothering others. Maybe don't throw it directly at your sibling's wall, but, just sort of think about, how can I adapt this so that I'm not miserable, right? Don't fight yourself. Work with your innate design. This is a really, really important thing. I usually call it chunking with my students, but partializing tasks sounds so much nicer. Basically, taking something really big and scary and cutting it up into discrete small steps. So this is an example of learning how to tie your shoes, right? If you're just doing it in one big action, that's going to seem really confusing, really intimidating. But if you break it down into smaller steps and then have the student review those steps, now it doesn't seem as intimidating. It's just like, okay, well, I can do that small piece, and then I can try that small piece, and then I can try that small piece. If your student gets stuck, instead of saying, okay, well, do it this way, questions are really important. I like to say that executive function coaching is the art of asking really good questions. So here are some really good questions that I've got for you. Can you describe what it feels like? Or have you ever felt the same feeling on other tests or in other situations? The more that you can get them to think about times in the past where they struggled and then succeeded or found a way out, letting experience be their teacher, hugely important. Again, what has worked in the past to get you unstuck? Another really great question in that regard. Or what about this particular passage or question gave you trouble? And how do you think you can move past this if and when it happens on test day, right? Like, it is important to visualize success, but sometimes you're on test day and you're looking at a math problem and your mind blanks. Well, what are you going to do? Is the thought, well, I'm going to panic, or I'm going to leave the room? Or is it, I am going to star it and then I'm going to come back to it? And that is my plan, so that if and when it happens, you don't have to panic. It's part of your plan. So you're trying to get your student to think about problem solving strategically, right? Get that prefrontal cortex moving. You want to move from you're frustrated. Okay, I'm going to analyze what happened. Okay, now I'm going to come up with an action. Assistive technologies. So this is a case where technology can be your friend, whether that's printed notes because you have dysgraphia and writing notes down just is not helping you, audio recordings so you can listen to what the teacher was saying, a video recording. I know we all probably got very sick of those when we were all on Zoom, but it's always an option. E-readers, if that's easier to read than a book or less likely to get lost, or productivity apps. Oh my goodness, there's so many, and I'm happy to go into those once I'm done with the body of my talk, all my different favorite productivity apps. So assistive technologies, I promised I was going to dive into it. So here you go. This is courtesy of our friends at Curry College. They've created this fantastic app wheel, basically where, depending on what you're looking at, they have apps for studying or writing or organization or reading. So for studying, you're thinking about, I need to gather my information. I need to work on my memory. I need to create a mind map or a mind palace to be able to remember things. So that could be, using Khan Academy or using a browser that has bookmarks that you're able to organize. With writing, you're talking about note-taking or recording lectures or using speech to text or word processing. So that could be, using something that's like Evernote or notes on your phone to be able to keep track of things. I know that whenever I've got an important meeting with, say, a medical professional, I am always taking notes on my notes on my notes app on my phone, because I know I'm going to get really nervous and frantic and I'm not going to remember it. Organization, reminders and to-do lists. Oh my goodness. Calendars, digital storage. I live and die by my calendar. If it's not in my calendar, I am not going to do it. And I can set up reminders for myself, like 2 weeks out, remember to check in with this person, or 2 weeks out, remind yourself so that you can start writing the draft so that you can then discuss it 2 weeks from now. The more that you can automate, the less you have to worry about your mind remembering anything. And lastly, reading. There are digital textbooks, PDF readers, ability to scan things. There's so many like book apps and just different ways of getting that information than there used to be. Something else that I talked about at the very beginning when I was talking about executive function skills is some things that are kind of on the social emotional scale, right? Like where you're having difficulty, say, self-regulating. So there's a lot of comorbidity challenges when it comes to social emotional disabilities as well. And a lot of this work that I've got right here comes from a book that I really, really love, which is called Brain Hacks: Work Smarter, Stay Focused, and Achieve Your Goals. I've never met Dr. Lara Anos-Webb, but I admire her greatly. I think this is a really wonderful book, especially because she doesn't make it if you have ADHD, this is a good book for you. This is a good book for anyone who looks at how they're living and thinks, I bet I could do this more efficiently. I bet I could do this in a way where I'm not constantly stressed out. So in the social emotional regulation portion of this book, she does a lot of work in working on identifying your emotions, being able to realize like, oh, I'm kind of feeling sad, or I'm feeling frustrated, working on using visualizations to gain distance from your thoughts, not in a I'm going to dissociate kind of way, but more in a I am not my thoughts. And just because I'm sad right now doesn't mean I'm always going to be sad. Learning how to listen to your body, doing a body scan, sort of, closing your eyes and kind of thinking your way down from the top of your head to the tips of your toes. How am I feeling? Am I carrying any stress? Am I slouching? Am I, do I have a headache? This is a pretty good checklist that I ask my students. Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Have I been outside today? And if the answers are yes, yes, no, then you need to eat something, drink something, and touch some grass. So, just sort of thinking like, I'm feeling this deep emotional upset, but have I also attended to my physical needs as well? Because all of that's linked. You also want to build emotional resilience, right? And I think that I've heard that so much throughout the pandemic and now as we're trying to move past it, that the emotional resilience just isn't there, especially for our younger population. So building emotional resilience is about recognizing the feeling that you have of like, okay, I recognize that I'm sad. I'm sad because I didn't get into the school play. And then identifying the positives, not toxic positivity, but things like, okay, well, I was scared to audition, but I auditioned anyway. And I practiced my monologue before I went. And those are all really great things, right? Like you did the scary thing and you prepared for it. So then you need to create your action plan, whether it's, okay, I'm going to ask the drama teacher, what can I work on for next time? Or I'm going to get one of the seniors to coach me in my audition for the musical. Like figuring out what am I going to do differently, right? So taking that, not even a mistake, but, technically a failure, an I didn't get that yet kind of thing, and using that as a launch pad. And then, of course, managing your negative emotions, one of which is give yourself permission to grieve. You didn't get into the school play. That really stinks. You don't need to pretend that that feels great. So giving yourself permission to feel sad, to cry, to feel awful, to let it all out, and to generally build your uncertainty tolerance. So do scary things like audition for the school play where you might not get in. And then when you realize, okay, I didn't get in and I'm still alive and I'm okay, and I have friends and I have parents who love me and the world didn't end, that's going to mean that the next time that there's a scary, possibly uncertain thing coming up, that they're more likely to go for it. So now looking at more specific learning differences and how we can help those folks, helping students with ADHD. So again, looking for strength in the diagnosis, right? If you have ADHD and you're hyper focusing, that can be really helpful when you need to get work done and just grind it out, right? There's a reason why our brains evolve in different ways. ADD does not need to spell disaster as long as you know how you work and you're able to work around it. Again, fidgeting is fine. Just because somebody is fiddling with something, it doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. Personally, I don't love fidget spinners, not because they're annoying, but because I don't think there's enough movement. It's too easy to move them. I would want my students to do like a Rubik's Cube, or I had a student who really loved drawing orbits. Because he wants to go to Mars, which is so cool. So like just make sure that it's something that's genuinely getting the movement out. I think that annotating, actively reading can be really helpful. Trying to keep yourself to not move takes up way too much brain space. So let yourself move, free up those mental resources. Moving from topic to topic can sometimes reboot your brain and help you to maintain focus. So if you realize I've been working on my grammar homework for 30 minutes and I am staring off into space, great, I'm going to do math now. The Pomodoro technique, one of my favorite things to do, I think everyone could benefit from it, regardless of whether you are neurotypical or neurodivergent, is the Pomodoro technique. 25-minute chunks, and then you take a 5-minute break. There are so many different apps out there that do the Pomodoro technique. You can set it up for you to work as long as you want, to take your break as long as you want. If you've got ADHD, you might want to do 15 minutes of work and 20 minutes of break. Just make sure that you set that timer. What I was talking about before with chunking. So you want to view full sections of the assignment, but in smaller chunks. So breaking everything up into smaller pieces, and then that helps with initiation. So it's not like, oh, I have to do this big scary thing. It's I'm going to do part 1 of big scary thing today, and then I'm going to do part 2 tomorrow, right? And you want to set your short time limits and your small goals. 2 minutes, better than no minutes. And putting short breaks into your study sessions. Moving, walking, looking away from the computer, going outside. If you're working with the student, helping them to study, chat for a moment. How's it going? Just sort of let them take that mental break. There's an app that I really love that I've been using with some of my students lately, called the Beeper app. It was actually developed by NASA to make sure that people were staying focused when it was like mission critical. And basically all it is when it beeps, you have to tap it to say that you're still on task. And you can set it for certain intervals. So if I'm going to focus for 25 minutes and then I'm going to break, but I have to work on my computer and I'm kind of worried that I'm going to go on Facebook if I'm on my computer, you can just sort of set the Beeper app for as long as you want it to be. You just tap it to show that you're still on task. I love it because it sort of feels like someone's watching me, and that can be really helpful because it's kind of like my conscience watching me a little bit. But then it forces me to take a break and make sure that I actually stop when the beeper goes off. But again, distractions are going to happen and it's going to be okay. So if you are working with a student, your kid or somebody else, and you're worried, and the student's worried about forgetting something that they want to discuss while they're studying, and that's why they keep coming up to you to talk about it, just have a pad of paper, maybe a whiteboard nearby so they can write down like, I am going to talk to you about this when I'm done. And then they don't have to worry about, I got to remember it. So it's not eating up the primary focus in their heads. So specifically for students with EF deficits for whom their desk might look a little something like this, these lovely executive function skills that I talked about earlier, really try to make sure that they don't have more than 3 things to do, because that can overwhelm. I would love to get more than 3 big things done every day, but realistically, like that's what I'm going for, right? So help them set goals, build their to-do list, facilitated by technology, and be really realistic about it. 20-minute increments, take a mental break, get up, move around. Having a homework book where all the information is really, really helpful, whether that is analog. I've got my trusty bullet journal right here, where I write everything down. Or, you could also want to keep it digital on Evernote, something like that. You just want to make sure that there's always some place where students can go to check. And again, attitude is everything. Every time that student makes progress, it is crucial to highlight it, to shout it out, to let them know that you see them progressing. Because if you feel like you're always losing things, you can never focus, the teacher's always saying, hey, look over here, you're going to be really hard on yourself from the beginning. The more a student sees themselves succeeding, the more confident they are about trying something new, attempting something challenging, and developing that grit, that emotional resilience that I was talking about earlier. Because the goal is self-efficacy, right? My goal with my EF students is that I put myself out of a job. I don't want to be coaching them forever. I want them to be able to get it all done without me, and then maybe tell me later how awesome they were. Google Calendar, I mentioned it. It is my lifesaver. And it's also really great to plan out things like, I'm going to drive to meet someone at the library, right? Because a lot of times those little interstitial bits get left by the wayside. Students can track their short and long-term projects and assignments and make sure that they schedule downtime. I'm going to go with my friend, like the more that they can then show you, this is what I'm doing, I've got it all under control, hopefully the less strife there will be as well. So for dyslexia, again, technology is your friend. Digital books. You can change the font to be something that you can read easier. There's text-to-speech assistive tech that helps students get through material faster. That recommendation section of the neuropsych report that I was talking up earlier, always worth a refresher to see what was recommended. And dyslexia can also impact math. So make sure that your student has support here, right? All of those nasty word problems can be really difficult. And one size doesn't fit all. Some students are going to slow down. They're going to want to read every word, every syllable. Other students might want to use mnemonics or little songs or rhymes to help encode things into their memory. And some students really respond well to active reading. So really engaging with the text. Like you can see right here, this is sort of annotating, writing down. starring the main idea, summarizing paragraphs with a few keywords. This can be really helpful for some students, either with EF challenges or dyslexia. And passages that are formatted with less white space, which can be more difficult for people with reading difficulties. Sometimes creating sort of a map of what's happening on the page can also be really helpful. Long text can be intimidating. So, cover up paragraphs, cover up diagrams, any sort of distracting content, rewrite the important information on the side, maybe bracket those first and last sentences as like, this is what my main idea is probably going to be. So as much physical engagement as possible. I strongly recommend this book if you are dyslexic or know someone who is and you want to understand a little bit more of what's going on with them. Books like The Dyslexic Advantage, which I have right up here, deep dive into the hidden benefits of having dyslexia and include excellent examples of people with dyslexia who are making a big difference in their chosen careers, in their families and societies. Strong recommend. It was a real eye-opener. And I know that various schools in the area that work with a lot of dyslexic students and a dyslexic population really recommend this book as well. So if you've got, say, memory or retrieval issues, it's really, you read something and then it goes right out your brain, you're going to be looking at limiting the amount of information you're trying to learn, keeping those sessions shorter, reviewing your prior knowledge so that you've got something to tie it to, spacing out those study sessions so that you can rehearse the information, reinforce it, bring it back, and using dual encoding. So something visual, something auditory, so you're remembering it in two different ways. Rehearse that information just after you learn it, come back to it within 24 hours, write it down, come up with a meaningful, structured way to think about it. And forced retrieval, my favorite thing, making yourself think of it 12 hours later, 24 hours later, 48 hours later, constantly strengthening that memory, strengthening the neural pathways. If you have a student with auditory processing issues, make sure you're always facing them. Get rid of distracting sounds, articulating clearly at a good pace. Don't use a ton of words. You just want to be clear to the point and make sure that they know that they can always ask you. If you have a student with math challenges, whether that's dyscalculia or something else, slow that problem-solving process down, break things down into steps. Is this relevant? Is this distracting? Helping them to figure that out. And reviewing previously taught concepts on a regular basis and check for comprehension. So in summary, every brain is different. There is no cookie cutter approach. You want to make sure you're being super positive, reinforcing, affirming. We want to build self-efficacy. Any individual grade along the way, not as important as shifting that self-concept and that belief. You want to be flexible, responsive, creative when working with students with LDs, really emphasizing strategy and problem solving. You want the student to have that sense of agency and make sure that they can advocate for themselves. So just as a reminder, every student is different, so we can make a custom recommendation for your student. We've got academic tutoring, test prep, and executive function coaching. And speaking of executive function coaching, you can give coaching a try and uncover your strengths and weaknesses. We have our students undergo a mind print assessment to uncover those growth areas and strengths. You'll get a custom coach match and a custom coaching plan. So you can call us directly at 866-789-7737 or schedule a 15-minute time to talk. We also have a writing workshop. So if you have any students who are really struggling to get their writing ready for high school, perhaps, it is a 5-part curriculum, your pace, your schedule, and you can also speak with a program advisor about that. So now we come in the last 5 or 6 minutes to a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. So Kevin wants to know, can we get a list of suggested apps? So on the slide where I had like that beautiful sort of circle of all those different apps, I do have a link to Curry College where they have that that whole flyer where you can take a look at it. So I would definitely recommend. But I'm also going to just take a little gander at my own phone, where I literally have a productivity section on my phone. So let's see, I've got a Scanner Pro that I use because it helps me capture documents a lot better than just taking a picture of them with my camera. So I'm able to capture things that way. I really love the Beeper app, as I noted before. That's really, really helpful for me. I also love, let's see, for my Pomodoro timer, which is really fun. Focus Keeper is the one that I really like using, which is a really good sort of, I'm going to set the time that I'm going to be working, and then I'm going to set my own breaks. I really like that one. It's got a little tomato picture in the app. And how does college fit in for those who made it through K through 12 and are not yet in the formal workplace where accommodations might be available? So I would say that it's never too late for a neuropsych evaluation. College becomes a little more complicated because the student is now kind of their own person, right? And so they would need to give the parent permission to be able to view their private information. But I would say that a neuropsych evaluation is always going to be helpful in getting accommodations in college as well. And your college may have resources to help you get that, potentially at a lower cost. If they've got a grad school for neuropsychologists, you might be able to get one at a discount. So that's something that you would definitely want to check in with your college resource center about. Let's see. Is there anxiety-based ADD? So I would say that ADD is not necessarily doesn't cover anxiety, but I would say that anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder is a very common comorbidity. So I would say that they do sometimes reinforce themselves. Let's see. What are ways you'd work with our high school senior with all the executive function issues you've mentioned, but fell through previous 504 plans and we don't know what to do moving forward? So I would want to talk with that student about what the 504 plans were and what wasn't working. Because I find sometimes students sort of feel like I should be able to do this or I should be able to do that, but that's just not how they work. So for instance, I was working with a student and he was really excited about the idea of this bullet journal. So he had his journal and we were writing in it. And then I came back and he was like, so that didn't work because it has a cover, which means that I'm not looking at my list all the time. So we realized that for him, it was much better to just have a list, right? Like with a no cover on it, just like a pad of paper that he could write things down on so that he could see it. So it's really thinking outside the box and thinking, what have you tried? Why didn't it work? And let's see. I'm trying to see. I think I've got time for like one more. Let's see. How can we get contact information for professionals in a given geographic area for a neuropsych evaluation? Anonymous attendee, if you send us an email at info@appleruth.com, I will be happy to make a personal referral to someone in your geographic area who will be able to get you an evaluation. And if they're not able to fit you in, they should be able to get you some other names. I'm lucky to work with a lot of really great professionals in that regard, and I would be happy to get a referral for you. All right. Okay, so I think that is all that I've got time for this evening. But if I wasn't able to answer your question, please feel free to email us at info@appleruth.com. I'm happy to carry the conversation offline. And otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you.